let's step back and look at sort of the big picture of what I want to hopefully have told you about today. And that is that, again, there's a standard way of looking for developmentally meaningful input differences, which looks to measure input differences, measure outcome differences, and look for some sort of correlation between the two. And what I wanted to offer today was a new complementary way to look for developmentally meaningful input differences that's going to use developmental computational modeling. Again, this is going to complement existing techniques. It's going to provide another way to try to identify those developmentally meaningful input differences if they are there, right? And we demonstrated this approach for syntactic island knowledge and in fact predicted no meaningful input differences across SES. We predicted the outcomes ought to be the same on the basis of the input available to these different populations of children. So this means, this is sort of the upshot here, is that any input-based interventions wouldn't be impactful because the input wouldn't be the problem. If we actually find any differences in the acquisition of these syntactic islands across SES, it's not because the input is different in a way that's a deficit, right? Instead, there's some other issue, right? But the input should support the development of this knowledge in the same way. That's what we predict. So input-based interventions are not going to help if there is a problem. You want to focus interventions on some other part of the developmental process. Now, something that's useful is that this technique of developmental computational modeling can provide a causal explanation, right? That's sort of something that I sort of harped on throughout, but the idea is that we're interested in how input differences could affect learning outcomes. Why does some aspect of the input matter? Well, that's what your developmental computational model is doing. It's implementing a particular theory that says how the input causes the knowledge to develop, why the input, why a particular part of the input matters or doesn't matter. And that's really great. For syntactic islands, it turns out that the building blocks needed for syntactic islands knowledge don't seem to differ enough across SES to matter, right? Like they do differ, but not in a way that affects the ability to develop the appropriate knowledge. That's the prediction. So something else that's useful is that this technique can make predictions about differences we expect in both child outcomes, right? That's the main sort of finding here, but also eventual adult knowledge, right? Remember here we're predicting a difference in the that trace violation, which is unacceptable, right, for a high SES adult speaker. What do you think that happens versus we are expecting it to be more acceptable for a low SES speaker? So differences we expect in eventual adult knowledge can surface through using this technique. And something that's, of course, very important to remember is any predicted differences, of course, still need to be measured, or any predicted non-differences, similarities, right, still need to be measured. But at least we know what to look for. We can focus our behavioral investigations on a very particular type of outcome, right? We can concentrate the efforts there on the basis of the model predictions. Something I think that's kind of a very nice bonus is that modeling is often faster and cheaper to do than behavioral work if the input samples have already been collected, right? That's a big task, absolutely, but if you already have the input samples, modeling is a lot faster and cheaper to do, so it can be very useful as a first pass input quality assessment, right? As we've shown here, you're assessing the input quality, so to speak, with respect to syntactic islands, and as a first pass, it looks pretty equivalent across SES. And something I think that's an extra bonus right now is it's very possible to do this just the same way you would otherwise during pandemic times, right? You don't need to actually interact with live humans to do this, which makes things a lot easier to do right now. So, keeping that in mind, what I think is let's use developmental computational modeling when we want to identify and understand developmentally meaningful input variation, right? If that's our goal, this is a great technique to do it. And with that, thank you so much for listening. And I want to especially thank my collaborator, my graduate student, Lundy Bates, whose work this is in collaboration with me. And thanks so much.